let's talk about much of this stuff that sort of like brings us up, is historical. But there are a couple of things that get touched on, and in the book that are very much in our future, and particularly in terms of our relationship with China. Give us a sense of what Chomsky's perspective is on this dynamic between Taiwan and mainland China.
Well, it's certainly not a defense of the authoritarianism of the Chinese government. But what he does point out over and over is that China is portrayed as a threat to the United States without much evidence for that. And a lot of things that are done in response to the perceived China threat, in fact, create the very threat that they're intended to guard against. There's been all this talk about the, quote, pivot to Asia that a lot of people in foreign policy circles believe is necessary, which consists a lot of kind of militarizing the region that is called the Indo-Pacific. This, in turn, makes China feel surrounded by U.S. military power and creates a military response, which in turn creates further evidence for supposed China threat. And again, this is a situation where we do to China things that we would perceive as aggression if they were done against us. Chomsky points to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the stationing of Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962, this idea that by coming into our domain, that was an act of aggression. Well, we do similar things to China, but we don't expect them to interpret it as an act of aggression. We talk a lot about Chinese spying. There's a new thing just today in the paper this morning about Chinese hacking, but we don't talk about our spying in China, which is also extensive. We expect them to tolerate things that we would never tolerate ourselves. And what Chomsky points out is that to understand what the actual situation is, you have to understand what both sides are doing. And in fact, the situation with China is an example of what is classically referred to in foreign policy as the security dilemma, which is a name for a situation where each side takes actions that it perceives as defensive, but that the other side perceives as offensive. And one of the core arguments that Chomsky makes about why U.S. foreign policy endangers the world, as the subtitle of the book says, is that we don't ever analyze the things that we do, we always perceive as defensive, that are then perceived as aggressive by the other side, that then create a reaction that we perceive as aggression, requiring more things that we see as defense or security on our side, which creates further reaction on the other side. And that understanding, that self-scrutiny, know thyself, he says, is crucial to keeping these conflicts from getting out of control. Like the conflict with China, he warns that if it gets out of control, I mean, this could be a nuclear war between great powers. I mean, it could be a massive arms race. It could be a real human catastrophe, the worst in our history.
But how much of that, like, I mean, some of that sounds a little bit like the bumbling empire theory, as opposed to this is our way of saying, like, look, we are setting our boundaries for some economic territory. Like we want, and like so much of this was outlined in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is basically saying, like, we're going to have hegemony over the economic system of everything that surrounds you, so that our, whatever we produce is produced under, and the rules of essentially the world are our rules, our copyright, our trademark, our production flow, whatever it is. And the military part in there is to go like, and if you don't like it, we're gonna do this brinksmanship. Like, where does that, I mean, it feels like, on some level, like we don't know what we're doing in escalating, but I sort of feel like we do. We're playing chicken, and we're doing it because we want to have this economic control. And by we, I mean the certain corporations want the economic control.
And right, we have like the infrastructure to actually have that threat of military dominance, which other countries don't. So we can back it up.
I mean, this is critically important because, again, you're going to see in all discussions about Taiwan, they're all framed in idealistic terms. Taiwan is a democracy. China poses a threat to this democracy. We have to protect this little democracy. Now, it's true that Taiwan is under threat from an authoritarian government in China. That's not false, but it is false that that's the reason why the United States is so committed to making sure that China does not absorb Taiwan. And if you look at U.S. national security documents, if you look at the national security strategy written under Trump or Biden, they're all pretty open about saying that what we're trying to do is contain China's rise and maintain American power in the Indo-Pacific, and that what we don't want is a competitor power. It's remarkable when you actually read documents written by the United States government how openly they talk in these power terms, these power concepts about containing the rise of China, and then all of the idealism kind of slips away, and we understand that what we're concerned with is our country's power relative to other countries' power.
Let's talk a little bit about like what we can do about this, because it is rare, it seems to me, that any of our foreign policy really makes a huge difference to Americans. Now, I would say, like, I'll put an asterisk and alongside that. I think, if you're under the age of 40 and are on social media, like, your awareness and I think disgust about what's happening in Gaza is really different than it's been since I think like Vietnam was televised, the first televised war. But of course, in Vietnam, there was the added sort of dynamic of a lot of U.S. Young people going to fight in this war, and I think there was an anti-war movement for the Iraq War, but it was largely ignored, and if anything, it impacted the outcome of elections. For and against, equally, in terms of like, so what is the solution, to the extent that there is one, to this?
Yeah, well, the book, when people crack open the book, they'll see that it does in fact end on a kind of optimistic note, which I made sure of, because Chomsky doesn't always end on an optimistic note, but he does say here and there optimistic things about social movements and what they can accomplish and what they have accomplished, in fact, in his own lifetime. He was really impressed by the rising anti-war movement around Vietnam, because for the first few years there was no anti-war movement, and then anti-war sentiment developed, and it did constrain the actions of the United States government. I mean, not sufficiently, and the war dragged on, and you could say that there's arguments over the extent to which the anti-war movement actually made a difference. But one thing that he argues is clear that one to the respect to which it did make a difference was the Vietnam syndrome, which we have discussed, which is to say that after the Vietnam War, even if it didn't stop the Vietnam War, it created that public reluctance to support the use of force that then forced the United States government to rely more on small scale and covert activities in Central America, for example. And in fact, in Central America, when Iran-Contra happened, it was Democrats who were kind of formed by the experience of the Vietnam War who were leading the opposition to Reagan, fairly mainstream Democrats. There was a healthy anti-war sentiment in the country that constrained the Reagan administration's ability to act. And I would argue that even though the Iraq War movement didn't stop the Iraq War, the fact that there was a huge movement and then that movement was completely vindicated by what actually happened in the war, really established a baseline anti-war consensus in the United States that is enduring to this day. It
certainly helped Trump, I think, on some level. I mean, sadly enough.
Trump has to posture as anti-war, right? Trump understands that the public is anti-war. He promises, if you look at his speeches, he's constantly promising peace. He's saying, well, the Democrats are going to drag us into World War III. I'm going to prevent World War III. He's lamenting what happened in Gaza, saying never would have happened on his watch. I'm going to keep you out of war is basically like Trump's message. And in fact, it even got like a number of Muslim voters to support Trump. The Iraq War movement had a really positive long-term effect on public opinion in American politics. Like, yeah, it's true that Biden just announced another $8 billion in weapons aid to Israel, but I would also argue that the anti-war sentiment in the United States is part of why the Democrats just lost an election. And that, it's hard. It's very, very hard for the public to constrain the use of American power when the leaders of both parties are going to pursue similar policies, right? I don't think we're going to see that much difference between Trump and Biden and what they're doing in Gaza. So what the public can do is quite limited. But at the same time, like, what alternative is there but to scrutinize, to expose the myths, to expose what is actually happening, and do what you can to try and keep atrocities from continuing indefinitely.
All right. Lastly, let me ask you this. I mean, over the course, obviously, you're working on a book that is more focused on foreign policy and sort of the way that the U.S. Public is manipulated or at least kept in the dark as to what the actual agendas are and where it's going. But over the course of the time that you were working on the book with Chomsky, and he's obviously very late in life and is not doing particularly well and largely incommunicado as far as I can tell. But over the course of the time that you were working with him and even prior to that, what was your sense of his, like, where was he domestically in terms of optimism or pessimism? I mean, or was it? I mean, there's a quality of Chomsky where it's almost like he doesn't have optimism or pessimism. It's more like this is the way it is, and this is what needs to be done.
Yeah. I think that's an accurate characterization. I mean, he says, and we have at the end of the book, essentially there's one alternative is say, let's give up, which guarantees, he says, that the worst will happen. And the other is to say we want things to be better, so we're going to try to make them better. He quotes the old phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think it's fair to say that before, he had a major stroke in 2023 that left him, and he hasn't been doing interviews since then. But in the lead up to that, he was not feeling particularly hopeful about the state of the world. He'd been very inspired by the Bernie Sanders movement, and then, very depressed by the rise of Donald Trump, who he consistently called the worst criminal in human history. And he included Hitler in that because he literally thinks Trump is worse than Hitler because of because of the long-term effects of the climate catastrophe. So not feeling particularly good, but never lost that sense that there is essential. I mean, a man who is at 95 doing constant interviews and writing, trying desperately to change the world, is not someone who has lost all hope that things can be different, right? Up until the point where he could no longer do the work he was doing, he has been an activist from the moment that the Vietnam War started to the present day.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like Buber or somebody who says, like, you got a choice to believe in God or not. It's just it's easier to believe in it. You don't really have much other choice on some level. I'm not sure I subscribe to that, but that is, we got really basically two choices. One is give up, or one is to not give up. Again, congratulations on this book. It really. Oh, there we go.
There it is.
Oh, there we go.
What do they call that?
Mirror
Twinning?
image.
It's not
Nathan J.
2010.
Robinson, editor in chief of Current Affairs. The book is Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. Also, congrats again on Current Affairs 50th
50 print issues. A print magazine may get to 50
still
in 2024.
Still kicking around. 2025.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Oh,
I made the same mistake today. We'll put a link both to the book and Current Affairs. Nathan, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Emma. Nice to see you both.
Thanks, Nathan.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.